I found out my husband no longer owned the fortune the same morning he came to evict me, but I didn't say a word. The first time I saw fear in Richard Collins' eyes was not the day he inherited $4.2 million from his late uncle, and it wasn't the afternoon he handed me a neatly folded letter telling me to vacate the house within 30 days, it was 6 months later in a quiet law office downtown, when the attorney cleared his throat and said, "There seems to be a complication." But that morning, when everything still looked polished and triumphant on his side of the table, I simply folded my hands in my lap and listened. We had been married for 41 years. Long enough to raise 2 children, pay off a 30-year mortgage, and watch our hair turn from brown to silver together. When his uncle Howard passed away in Florida, leaving Richard the bulk of his estate, the news traveled through our family like a summer storm rolling across open farmland. Sudden. Loud. Electrifying. Richard stood in the kitchen holding the phone, his face flushed with a boyish excitement I hadn't seen in decades. "Margaret," he said, his voice almost trembling, "we're set for life." I remember the way the morning light came through the blinds, striping the hardwood floors we had refinished ourselves back in 1998. I remember the coffee growing cold in my mug as he talked about investments, lake properties, and finally taking that cruise through Alaska he'd always postponed. I smiled and nodded. I even reached out and squeezed his arm. But something in his eyes had shifted. It wasn't joy alone. It was calculation. Over the next few days, the house felt different. Richard began taking calls in his study with the door closed. He bought a new suit from a boutique downtown, something tailored and sharp that cost more than our first car payment. He changed the password on his phone. These were small things. The kind a wife of 4 decades notices without trying. Then, on a Thursday morning exactly 24 hours after the inheritance funds officially cleared, he asked me to sit down at the dining room table. He did not yell. He did not accuse. He simply slid an envelope across the polished wood. "I think it would be best if you found somewhere else to stay for a while," he said, as if suggesting I try a different brand of coffee. I looked at the letter. Legal language. Temporary separation. 30 days. The words felt clinical and distant, like they belonged to someone else's marriage. "I've already spoken to an attorney," he added, adjusting the cuff of that new suit. "This house is in my name." I noticed he didn't say our house. Just my name. There was no mention of the late-night calls. No confession. But I had seen enough in the weeks before. A woman's laugh drifting through the speaker once when he thought I couldn't hear. A receipt for dinner at a waterfront restaurant 40 miles away on a night he claimed to be at a board meeting. I did not confront him. I did not cry. I stood up, walked to the hallway closet, and took down one of our old suitcases. The same navy blue Samsonite we used when we drove Route 66 back in 1987. "You're taking this rather calmly," he said, almost disappointed. I paused long enough to look at him. "After 41 years, I replied quietly, I've learned not to react too quickly." What he didn't know was that 2 days before he handed me that letter, I had sat in a different office across town. A smaller one. Less polished. An attorney named Daniel Reeves had explained a clause buried deep in Uncle Howard's estate documents. A clause triggered by certain personal decisions made within the first 12 months of inheritance. I didn't tell Richard that. I didn't need to. I zipped the suitcase closed, rolled it across the same hardwood floors we once danced on in our socks, and walked out the front door without looking back. He believed he had stepped into a new life of wealth and freedom. He believed I was the one being left behind. And for a little while, I let him believe that. I drove east for 3 hours that afternoon, keeping both hands steady on the steering wheel even when my vision blurred for a moment at the exit ramp. I did not check into a hotel near our town. I did not want anyone reporting back to Richard about where I was staying. Instead, I rented a small furnished apartment in a quiet suburb where no one knew my name, a place with beige carpeting, neutral walls, and a view of a grocery store parking lot. It was not glamorous, but it was peaceful. That first night, I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed and placed my wedding ring on the nightstand beside me. I did not throw it. I did not cry over it. I simply looked at the faint line it had left on my finger after 4 decades and understood that some marks take longer to fade than others. The next morning, I made coffee using a small drip machine that hummed louder than the one at home. I opened my laptop and reviewed the notes Daniel Reeves had given me 2 days earlier. The clause was clear, though it was buried beneath pages of financial language. Uncle Howard had structured his estate with what he called a character provision. If Richard filed for divorce or legally separated from his spouse within 12 months of receiving the inheritance, a substantial portion of the assets would be redirected into a charitable trust already established in my name. Not half. Not a token percentage. The majority. When Daniel first explained it to me, I had asked him to repeat the numbers twice. It felt unreal. Uncle Howard had always liked me. He once told me I was the only one in the family who did not treat him like an open wallet at Thanksgiving dinner. I never imagined he would protect me this way. Richard, on the other hand, had not read the documents thoroughly. He had skimmed the summary and focused only on the final balance. He assumed wealth meant control. He assumed removing me from the house meant removing me from the equation. I spent that week quietly organizing copies of every shared financial statement from the past 5 years. I forwarded emails to a secure account. I made a list of dates and transactions, including the dinner receipts from the waterfront restaurant and the luxury boutique purchase charged to our joint card the day after he told me to leave. I did not gather these things out of spite. I gathered them because facts have a way of standing calmly in rooms where emotions lose their balance. On Sunday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard. He wrote that he hoped I was settling in and that this arrangement would be easier for both of us. The word arrangement lingered in my mind. It sounded temporary. Convenient. I responded with a simple message that I was fine and that I appreciated the clarity. I could almost feel his relief through the screen. He believed I was accepting defeat with grace. What he did not know was that Daniel had already drafted a formal acknowledgement of separation, waiting for Richard to sign and submit his filing. The clock had started the moment he asked me to leave. 12 months. That was the window Uncle Howard had designed. I did not need to provoke anything. I did not need to rush. All I had to do was allow Richard to continue believing that the fortune was entirely his and that I had quietly stepped aside. In the evenings, I walked around the block near the apartment complex, passing trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes, thinking about how easily people mistake silence for weakness. 41 years of marriage had taught me many things, but the most valuable lesson was this: the person who speaks the least often sees the most. And as the days moved forward, I watched, I waited, and I kept every document neatly filed in a folder labeled simply with my initials. 3 weeks after I left the house, Richard filed for legal separation exactly as I knew he would, and he did it with the confidence of a man who believed the ground beneath him was solid. Daniel called me the same afternoon the paperwork was recorded with the county clerk. His voice remained calm, almost clinical, as he confirmed the date and time stamp. The clock had officially started. 12 months sounded long when measured in ordinary life, but in financial terms it was a fragile window. I thanked him, closed my laptop, and sat quietly at the small kitchen table in my apartment, watching a delivery truck unload boxes across the parking lot. Everything outside looked routine. Inside, a slow shift had begun. Richard called 2 days later. He spoke as though we were discussing landscaping plans rather than dissolving a marriage. He said he hoped we could handle everything respectfully and efficiently. He mentioned that he had begun consulting with an investment advisor about reallocating the inheritance into commercial properties and municipal bonds. His tone carried pride, and beneath it, impatience. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I simply said that I wished him clarity and good judgment. He laughed lightly, mistaking my restraint for surrender. Later that evening, I drove past the waterfront restaurant where I had once seen his car parked near the entrance. The lights reflected on the lake in soft golden streaks. I did not go inside. I did not need confirmation. What I needed was perspective. 41 years of shared meals, shared holidays, shared losses, and he had chosen to measure loyalty against a bank balance. That realization did not shatter me. It settled over me like a thin layer of frost, quiet and undeniable. Over the following weeks, small updates reached me through mutual acquaintances. Richard had been seen at a charity gala with a younger woman on his arm. Vanessa Hale. 38 years old. A consultant, someone said. Ambitious. Stylish. I did not react to the description. Age had taught me that appearances are often the least stable part of any story. Daniel kept me informed of each procedural step. Motions filed. Assets disclosed. Accounts itemized. Richard's legal team requested a preliminary division of property, confident in the assumption that the inheritance stood entirely separate from marital distribution. The clause in Uncle Howard's estate remained untouched, almost invisible, waiting like a quiet signature at the bottom of a long letter. I continued my walks each evening, circling the same 3 blocks until the sky turned violet and porch lights flickered on. I thought about the early years of my marriage, when Richard and I saved spare change in a ceramic jar labeled vacation fund. We once celebrated paying off a $10,000 loan with takeout pizza and sparkling cider. Wealth had not built our foundation. Patience had. Sacrifice had. And now, ironically, patience would determine how this ended. One afternoon, Daniel invited me to review a draft of the charitable trust documentation that would activate if the separation became permanent within the 12-month period. My name appeared in careful legal script as trustee. The purpose of the trust focused on community housing initiatives, something Uncle Howard had quietly supported for years. I traced the lines of text with my finger, not out of greed, but out of recognition. Richard believed he had stepped into power the moment the inheritance cleared. He believed removing me from the house removed me from consequence. What he did not understand was that timing carries weight in ways money cannot override. The more confident he became, the closer he moved toward triggering the very clause he had overlooked. I folded the copy of the document and placed it back in its envelope. Outside, traffic moved steadily down the main road, headlights blinking in orderly rhythm. Life continued without spectacle. And I remained exactly where I needed to be, watching a man mistake speed for strategy while the calendar moved quietly in my favor. By the 3rd month of our separation, Richard had grown comfortable in the version of events he had constructed for himself. He moved Vanessa into the house in early spring, just as the dogwood trees along our street began to bloom. A neighbor mentioned it casually over the phone, her voice hesitant, as though she expected me to collapse at the news. I thanked her for letting me know and asked how her grandchildren were doing in school. After we hung up, I sat still for a long time, not because I was surprised, but because confirmation has a way of closing doors that denial leaves slightly open. I could picture Vanessa walking across the hardwood floors I had polished every December, setting her handbag on the kitchen counter where I once rolled out pie crust for Thanksgiving. I imagined new towels in the bathroom cabinet, new perfume lingering in the hallway. I did not resent her presence. What unsettled me was the speed. 41 years reduced to a seasonal change. Daniel called that same week to inform me that Richard's attorney had requested a preliminary hearing to formalize property division. The confidence in their filing was almost impressive. They referenced the inheritance as a separate asset, protected and untouched by marital claim. They did not anticipate resistance. They did not anticipate patience. I drove to Daniel's office the following Tuesday, arriving 10 minutes early as I always did. The waiting room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. When Daniel stepped out to greet me, he carried a slim folder and a look of measured anticipation. He explained that once the court recognized the separation date, the estate clause would remain dormant but active, waiting for any action that finalized the dissolution within 12 months. If Richard chose to proceed quickly, as his filing suggested, the redistribution would trigger automatically. There would be no dramatic confrontation. No raised voices. Only paperwork and numbers quietly shifting. Columns. I nodded, absorbing each detail the way I once memorized grocery budgets when our children were young. Back then, $10 mattered. Now, millions were moving on a timeline dictated by impatience. That evening, I returned to the apartment and sorted through an old box of photographs I had brought with me. There was one from our 25th anniversary, Richard standing beside me on the back porch, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling into the late summer sun. I studied his face in that picture, searching for signs of the man who now measured loyalty in square footage and account balances. Perhaps he had always wanted more. Perhaps the inheritance simply removed the need to pretend otherwise. My phone buzzed again the next morning with a message from him. He wrote that he hoped I was adjusting well and that he intended to resolve everything before the end of the year so that we could both move forward. The phrasing was efficient, almost corporate. I responded with a single sentence that I trusted his judgment. He did not detect the quiet precision in those words. Each time he pushed for speed, he moved closer to the boundary Uncle Howard had drawn. Weeks passed, and I kept careful track of every filing date. Every motion. Every signature. I did not need to argue. I did not need to defend myself publicly. The law, when read thoroughly, can be more decisive than anger. One afternoon, Daniel forwarded me a draft timeline projecting how quickly the case might conclude if Richard remained aggressive. The estimate placed finalization well within the 12-month period. I placed the printed page beside my coffee cup and watched steam curl upward in thin, delicate spirals. Richard believed he had replaced me with a brighter future. He believed wealth had simplified his choices. What he did not realize was that the very haste he mistook for strength was narrowing his path. And as the calendar continued to turn quietly on my kitchen wall, I remained steady, knowing that sometimes the most powerful move is allowing someone to walk confidently toward a door they have not bothered to read. By the 6th month, the house on Maple Ridge Drive no longer resembled the life I once kept inside it. Mutual acquaintances mentioned renovations, new furniture deliveries, and a grand dinner party hosted by Richard and Vanessa to celebrate what he called his second chapter. The phrase reached me through a friend who sounded apologetic, as though she were delivering bad news about the weather. I thanked her and told her that seasons change whether we approve of them or not. That evening, I sat at my small kitchen table with a legal pad and began marking dates in careful ink. The separation had been filed in early March. If the divorce concluded before the following March, the estate clause would activate without exception. Daniel confirmed that Richard's attorney had submitted accelerated motions to streamline the process. They cited irreconcilable differences and a desire for swift resolution. The irony was almost gentle. The faster Richard moved to detach himself from me, the closer he edged toward relinquishing the very inheritance that had fueled his urgency. A week later, I received formal notice of a preliminary court appearance scheduled for late September. I drove to Daniel's office the day before to review our strategy. He explained that we would not challenge the separation itself. We would not argue over household furnishings or minor accounts. We would simply allow the timeline to unfold. When he slid a copy of Uncle Howard's estate provision across the desk again, I noticed how ordinary the paper looked. No dramatic font. No bold warnings. Just a paragraph outlining redistribution if marital dissolution occurred within 12 months of inheritance. The majority of the funds would transfer to the Collins Community Housing Trust, a charitable entity legally bound under my trusteeship. Richard would retain a modest portion, enough to prevent hardship, but not enough to sustain the image he had already begun constructing. I drove home along the interstate, passing exit signs that flickered in the late afternoon light. I thought about the dinner party I had heard about. White table linens. Crystal glasses. A toast to new beginnings. I did not resent the celebration. I understood it. Wealth has a way of convincing people that momentum equals permanence. In October, court proceedings moved forward with surprising efficiency. Richard appeared confident in every filing, requesting finalization before the end of the calendar year. Daniel advised me to remain composed and avoid public commentary. That instruction required little effort. Silence had become my strongest ally. On the morning of the next hearing, I wore a simple navy dress and pearl earrings I had owned for 20 years. I arrived early, as always, and took a seat near the back of the courtroom. Richard entered 10 minutes later with Vanessa beside him. He did not look in my direction. His posture suggested assurance, as though he were concluding a routine business transaction. When the judge reviewed the timeline and acknowledged the anticipated final decree within the 12-month window, I felt no surge of triumph. Only clarity. The mechanism Uncle Howard designed was nearly complete. After the session, Richard's attorney approached Daniel to discuss logistical details. Their conversation carried the relaxed tone of men who believed the matter was procedural. They did not reference the estate clause. They did not suspect that the very efficiency they praised would redirect millions of dollars into a trust bearing my name. That evening, I returned to the apartment and brewed a cup of chamomile tea. Outside, the air had turned crisp, and fallen leaves collected along the curb in quiet clusters. I reviewed the calendar once more, tracing the months with steady fingers. Richard believed he had built a faster future. He believed decisive action demonstrated strength. What he did not see was that every expedited signature brought him closer to a door already outlined in ink long before he chose to walk away. And as the year drew toward its final quarter, I remained patient, understanding that sometimes the most significant consequences arrive not with noise, but with a stamp of approval on a page few people bother to read. By early December, the air carried that thin metallic chill that settles in before the first real snow, and the calendar on my apartment wall showed 9 months since Richard filed for separation. The court had scheduled the final hearing for mid-January, well within the 12-month threshold Uncle Howard had written into his estate. Richard had insisted on that date, pressing his attorney to secure the earliest available slot. He wanted the year to begin clean, as he had described it in one of his brief phone messages. Clean. The word lingered with quiet irony. Daniel invited me to his office the week before Christmas to review the final documents. The dissolution papers were orderly, almost elegant in their simplicity. Asset division reflected Richard's assumption that the inheritance stood separate and untouched. My share consisted primarily of retirement accounts accumulated before the windfall, along with a modest cash settlement he likely considered generous. Daniel turned to the final page and tapped the margin gently. He explained that once the decree was signed and entered into record before March, the redistribution clause would activate automatically. There would be no dramatic notification. No courtroom announcement. The estate trustee would process the transfer quietly, as outlined. I listened carefully, asking only one question about timing. He confirmed that the trust documents had already been prepared and were waiting for activation. When I left his office, holiday lights lined the storefronts downtown, blinking in steady patterns of red and white. I walked slowly past a bakery window filled with gingerbread houses and frosted sugar cookies, remembering the years I had baked dozens of them in our kitchen while Richard complained about the mess of flour on the counter. That kitchen now held someone else's laughter. I did not feel anger. I felt distance. On New Year's Eve, my phone vibrated with a short message from Richard. He wrote that he hoped the coming year would bring clarity for both of us and that he believed we were making the right decision. I read the message twice before setting the phone down. He believed he was closing a chapter he had outgrown. He did not realize he was about to reopen one he had never fully read. The morning of the final hearing arrived cold and bright. Frost coated the edges of parked cars outside the courthouse, and the American flag above the entrance snapped lightly in the wind. I wore the same navy dress and pearl earrings, the quiet uniform of steadiness I had adopted since March. Richard stood near the front of the courtroom with Vanessa beside him. She wore a pale coat and held a leather portfolio, her posture composed. When our eyes briefly met, there was no hostility, only acknowledgement. The proceedings moved swiftly. The judge reviewed the terms, confirmed mutual consent, and signed the decree without hesitation. The clerk stamped the page, and the sound of the rubber seal striking paper echoed more loudly than I expected. It was a small sound, but decisive. Richard exhaled audibly, relief softening his shoulders. He extended his hand to his attorney with a satisfied nod. In that moment, he believed the matter concluded. He believed the inheritance secure and the future fully under his direction. I remained seated for a few seconds longer, allowing the reality to settle not in emotion, but in sequence. The decree was finalized within the 12-month window. The clause was now in motion. Daniel caught my eye across the aisle and offered the faintest inclination of his head, a gesture so subtle it could have been mistaken for courtesy. Outside, as I stepped onto the courthouse steps, sunlight reflected off the thin layer of frost on the pavement, scattering light in quiet fragments. Richard walked past me without pausing, already speaking about investment plans for the coming spring. He did not know that the paperwork he celebrated had quietly redirected the majority of his newly inherited fortune into the Collins Community Housing Trust. He did not know that within days, the estate administrator would initiate the transfer. And as I walked toward my car, breathing in the sharp winter air, I understood that sometimes the most profound consequences arrive not with raised voices, but with a simple signature placed exactly where it was always meant to be. 3 days after the decree was entered into record, Richard received a certified letter from the estate administrator handling Uncle Howard's trust, and although I was not present when he opened it, I could imagine the sequence with perfect clarity because Daniel called me that afternoon with a tone he rarely allowed himself. He said the redistribution had officially been executed. The majority of the inheritance had transferred into the Collins Community Housing Trust as outlined in the clause, effective immediately upon confirmation of the finalized divorce within the 12-month period. Richard retained a designated portion, enough to avoid financial ruin, but nowhere near the $4.2 million he had been spending with such confidence. I was in my apartment kitchen when Daniel delivered the news, sunlight spilling across the counter in pale winter bands. I thanked him calmly and asked about the next procedural step. He explained that as trustee, I would oversee the Housing Initiative Board meeting within the next quarter, and that public records would reflect the transfer as an estate adjustment rather than a marital dispute. It was all very orderly. Later that evening, my phone rang. I recognized Richard's number immediately. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice did not carry anger at first. It carried confusion. He asked if I had known about the clause. I replied that Uncle Howard had always been thorough. There was a long silence on the line, the kind that reveals more than raised voices ever could. Richard said the administrator informed him that his decision to finalize the divorce within 12 months triggered the redistribution automatically. He repeated the word automatically as if it were an accusation. I did not argue. I did not remind him that he had insisted on speed. I simply said that legal documents tend to mean exactly what they say. His composure thinned. He mentioned investments he had already initiated, commitments he had made. He said Vanessa was in shock. I listened without interruption. When he finally asked why I had not warned him, I paused just long enough for the truth to settle between us. I told him that he had not asked. That was all. Over the next week, subtle ripples reached me through the same quiet network that once delivered news of dinner parties and renovations. The waterfront property he had placed under contract was withdrawn. The investment advisor had revised projections. Vanessa, according to a neighbor, had not been seen at the house as frequently. None of it was dramatic. There were no scenes on the front lawn. Just a gradual recalibration of expectations. One afternoon, I drove past Maple Ridge Drive for the first time since January. The dogwood trees were bare now, branches stretching thin against a gray sky. The house looked unchanged from the outside, brick steady and windows reflecting the late afternoon light. Yet I knew the interior felt different. Plans had shifted. Assumptions had dissolved. I did not stop the car. I did not slow down. I continued toward the highway, where traffic moved in consistent lanes, each driver following markings laid long before they arrived. That evening, Daniel forwarded confirmation documents showing the trust fully funded and operational. My name appeared in clear print as trustee. The purpose statement described affordable housing initiatives for families transitioning out of temporary shelters. Uncle Howard's quiet philanthropy had found structure, and Richard's haste had supplied the catalyst. I sat at the small dining table in my apartment, reviewing the pages with steady hands. 41 years of marriage had ended with a signature. $4.2 million had changed direction because of a clause few people would have noticed. Richard had believed wealth granted him leverage. He had believed that removing me from his life simplified his path. What he did not understand was that decisions carry weight beyond the moment they are made. As night settled outside my window and the parking lot lights flickered on, I folded the documents carefully and placed them back into their envelope. There was no triumph in the room. Only balance restored in a way that required no raised voice, no dramatic gesture, just the quiet certainty that patience, when paired with truth, often writes the final line. Winter softened into early spring with the quiet persistence of thawing ground, and by March the Collins Community Housing Trust held its first formal board meeting in a modest conference room downtown. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always did, carrying a leather folder that contained both the trust documentation and a simple agenda outlining proposed housing grants. The room was unremarkable, beige walls and a long rectangular table polished to a dull shine, but the purpose inside it felt steady and deliberate. Uncle Howard's vision had moved from ink on paper to actual allocation. Families transitioning out of temporary shelters would receive assistance for security deposits and first month's rent. Numbers that once represented indulgence now represented stability. As trustee, my role required composure, clarity, and consistency. I delivered each point without flourish, without commentary about how the funds had arrived here. Public records reflected an estate adjustment. There was no mention of divorce in the official minutes. Meanwhile, the ripple effect of the redistribution continued quietly elsewhere. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned that Richard had postponed several planned investments. The waterfront property remained unsold, the contract dissolved. Vanessa, according to a neighbor, had returned to her own condominium across town. No arguments echoed down Maple Ridge Drive. No spectacle unfolded on the lawn. Just a gradual shift in presence. One afternoon, my phone rang again. This time Richard's voice carried less confusion and more fatigue. He spoke of recalculating retirement plans, of consulting accountants about revised projections. He did not accuse me. He did not apologize. He simply sounded older. He said he had underestimated how binding Uncle Howard's clause would be. I listened, allowing him space to hear his own realization. When he paused, I told him that legal documents often reflect the values of the person who drafts them. Uncle Howard had valued commitment. That was all I said. In April, I visited a small 2-bedroom house on the edge of town that the trust had helped fund for a single mother and her young son. The house needed fresh paint and new curtains, but the front porch faced a line of maple trees that would bloom bright green by summer. The mother thanked me with eyes that carried both exhaustion and relief. I did not mention Richard. I did not mention inheritance. I simply told her that stability begins with one steady step. Driving back to my apartment, I reflected on how differently wealth can move depending on the hands that guide it. Richard had seen it as acceleration, as an exit ramp from a life he believed had slowed him. Uncle Howard had seen it as responsibility. I had not orchestrated the clause. I had not demanded redistribution. I had simply allowed the timing to unfold as written. By late May, the dogwood trees on Maple Ridge Drive had blossomed again, pale petals scattered across the lawns like confetti after a parade that no one quite celebrated. I drove past once more, not out of longing, but out of closure. The house stood unchanged, brick steady, windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Yet it no longer held my history. It held Richard's recalibrated expectations. As for me, I renewed the lease on my apartment for another year, not because I could not afford something larger, but because the space felt sufficient. In the evenings, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, reviewing grant applications and budget projections for the trust. The work required attention and patience, two qualities I had practiced long before any inheritance entered our lives. Richard once believed that money granted him authority to rewrite the story of our marriage overnight. What he learned, slowly and without spectacle, was that some stories carry clauses written long before the final chapter appears. And as spring light filtered through the blinds and settled across my small, steady home, I understood that sometimes the most profound victories are not loud at all. They are simply aligned. Summer arrived quietly, stretching long evenings across the city in soft gold light, and by July the Collins Community Housing Trust had approved its third round of grants. I moved through each board meeting with the same steady rhythm I once used to balance grocery lists and mortgage payments, listening carefully, asking measured questions, signing documents only after reading every line. The funds had begun to take shape in visible ways: renovated duplexes, repaired roofs, families receiving keys to small homes that smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. The work did not feel like revenge. It felt like alignment. One afternoon in late July, nearly 16 months after Richard had first asked me to leave the house, I received a handwritten letter forwarded through Daniel's office. The envelope carried Richard's familiar script, slightly slanted, the way he had always addressed holiday cards. I sat at my small dining table before opening it. The letter inside was brief. He wrote that he had sold the house on Maple Ridge Drive. The revised financial reality, as he described it, made maintaining the property impractical. He mentioned downsizing to a condominium near the lake, something more manageable. There was no reference to Vanessa. There was no mention of the dinner parties or the second chapter he once celebrated. He simply wrote that he hoped I was well and that perhaps time had taught him lessons he had been too impatient to learn before. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back into its envelope. There was no surge of satisfaction, no sharp intake of triumph. Only a quiet recognition that decisions echo long after the moment that inspires them. A week later, I drove past Maple Ridge Drive one final time. A for sale sign had already been removed, leaving a faint rectangle of brighter grass beneath where it once stood. The curtains in the front windows were different now, neutral and unremarkable. A young couple carried boxes across the lawn, laughing lightly as they coordinated their steps. The house no longer belonged to our history. It belonged to someone else's beginning. I did not slow the car. I did not park. I let the street pass behind me, merging into traffic with the ease of someone who no longer needs to look back to measure distance. That evening, I returned to my apartment and reviewed quarterly reports from the trust. 3 families had moved into stable housing. A 4th application sat pending approval. I made notes in the margins with a blue pen, the ink steady against clean paper. Wealth, I had learned, reveals character more clearly than poverty ever does. Richard had believed inheritance granted him power to rearrange his life overnight, to discard 41 years as though they were an outdated contract. He had not anticipated that the same document he celebrated would contain a clause reflecting a different set of values. Uncle Howard had written with intention. I had acted with patience. Richard had acted with speed. And in the end, the calendar favored the one who read carefully. As twilight settled outside my window and the hum of evening traffic softened into background rhythm, I poured a cup of tea and sat in stillness. I did not feel like a woman who had won something. I felt like a woman who had remained steady long enough for truth to complete its course. Richard inherited a fortune and believed it made him untouchable. He evicted me the next day, convinced he was stepping into control. What he never knew, until it was too late to change, was that the most powerful clause in his new wealth had been written long before he decided to let me go. And sometimes, that is enough.